These are the thoughts that are in my head. It's like 24/7.
So, what I feel like we're a bit. Welcome everyone. I'm going to move this over. Could you move? I don't know.
No, we can see all right.
It feels wrong. Okay.
Stand there. Stand there.
You're right there. Yeah. All right. Welcome everyone to part 2 of our Advent course on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So last week we looked at very broad scope of history in that part of the world. First, the land of Canaan, then the United Kingdom monarchy of Israel, then the 2 kingdoms of Judah and Israel, and then all the various occupying imperial powers, etc. And now we are looking at Israel in the modern day sense. So we finished last week with the Ottoman Empire, which had conquered that whole region and many other regions besides in the 15th century. So for 500, someone coming out here, I'll just wait. So for 500 years, Palestine has been controlled by the Ottoman Empire, by the Turks, and these are Arabs living here, not Turks, so they're they're definitely under a foreign power. And it wasn't called Palestine. So it says on your map here, Palestine, but it wasn't called Palestine. So the area of land that we see here was divided up into sort of various little kind of provinces, and it was very much a sort of backwater region of the Ottoman Empire. I told you last week it wasn't very well governed. There was no real infrastructure, policing, civil service, bureaucracy, anything like that. There were Palestinians living, Arabs living all over the region. Some of them were living on the coastal plains, which is very kind of lots of good soil, as we said, it's very flat. But most of them were living up in the hill country, which is in this area here. So if you look on the first maps, you can see just how varied the climate and the landscape of this part of the world is. So all this down here, because they're green, that's the coastal plain. So it's very flat. It's very kind of lush and everything. And then here, so Jerusalem on your map is sort of about there. So Jerusalem is up in the hill country. So it's Bethlehem. So all this here is what was known as the Judean wilderness. So this is where Judea and Samaria sort of used to be in the Bible. So most kind of biblical events took place in this area of hills that you see here. Further to the north, it gets green again. This is Galilee. So down here, where I'm circling, this is Lower Galilee. And this bit up here is Upper Galilee, or the Golan Heights. So these mountains up here is where Mount Hebron is, it's the Golan Heights. That's the Sea of Galilee, that's the Dead Sea. And this whole stretch of land in between is the Jordan Valley, which is very, very flat. This is a fault line. This is the tectonic plate fault line between the Asian plate and the African plate. And it's very, very seismically active. There's often lots of earthquakes along this fault line. And although it doesn't look it on this map, it looks quite green for some reason. This is not green, this bit here, this Jordan Valley. This is an absolute desert. And it's a different kind of desert from these desert hills here. So just in that very small area of land, which is about the size of Wales, there are these huge microclimates and topographical regions. So we ended last week by thinking about the 2 different types of Zionism that European Jews in Switzerland were proposing. So Herzl, at the first Jewish conference of Zionism in Basel in Switzerland, he conceived of Zionism as primarily a diplomatic, political initiative. He wanted to work with the great powers of Europe, so Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, Ottoman Empire, Britain, France, in order to achieve the creation of a Jewish state through diplomacy, and then the sort of peaceful transference, migration of Jews from these various European countries to a newly created Jewish state. He was motivated by, Herzl was motivated by national ideology, Jewish nationalism, rather than religion. He wasn't remotely religious. I think I mentioned last week that when he actually came to Jaffa on the coast to help with the newly arriving Jews, he didn't actually even visit Jerusalem, but until 3 years after he'd been there. He wanted to imitate European colonizing techniques, but he needed a charter from the great powers, and he specifically looked to the Russian Tsar and the Ottoman Sultan for help with doing this, but his aims never came to anything. He died in 1904 without achieving his dream, and most Jews were kind of against the idea anyway. They didn't like the idea of trying to achieve Zionism through diplomacy, because they just didn't think that the great powers would be interested in helping them. They saw Europe as an entirely anti-Semitic continent with no desire to help the Jewish people or create a Jewish state. So the more popular kind of Zionism was labor Zionism, which was the kind of Zionism proposed by David Ben-Gurion. So before the First World War, tens of thousands of Jews, this is from the 1880s, 1890s, the first century of the 20th, first decade of the 20th century, tens of thousands of Jews, probably about 85,000, more or less dispense with diplomatic niceties and decide they want to emigrate there of their own volition. And because there wasn't really much here in the Ottoman Empire to stop them, they just arrived. So these were the labor Zionists. Labor as in workforce, as in socialism. It was a very kind of Marxist idea of creation. It was a socialist idea of creating a Jewish colony there. So by 1914, there were 85,000 Jews in Palestine. So I got my numbers wrong. So 85,000 Jews in Palestine, 35,000 of these were recent Zionist arrivals. Now, there were two waves, or aliyot, which means ascension, two ascensions of Jewish settlers in the Holy Land. The first, which was between 1882 and 1903, encountered very significant difficulties as they were mostly reliant on wealthy Europeans or benefactors in helping them set up their communities, and they often profited from cheap Arab labor. So this first wave, this first aliyot, these first Jewish immigrants actually worked quite well with the Arabs who did exploit them, but there was a kind of a mutual sort of working relationship between Jews and Arabs at first. The second wave, which was from 1904 to 1914, was much bigger and was much more focused on creating an entirely separate Jewish society and economy. So these second wave of Jews, the second aliyot, they didn't really work with their Arab neighbors. They wanted to be separate from Arabs. They wanted to have their own Jewish identity rooted in the soil of the land, specifically the soil of that coastal plains. They were all moving into this coastal plain here in those early years of the 20th century. And they set up their own communities that we now call kibbutzes. And the whole idea of the kibbutz movement was that this was labor Zionism. This was their slogan, if you like. It was the conquest of labor. So they wanted to kind of conquer this land here through labor, through going there and setting up their own communities, buying land off Arab landowners at a good price, and then turning that land into large swathes of agriculture, so wheat, corn, maize, citrus fruits, which they exported to Europe. So it was very successful. So that was how the state of Israel, as we know it today, really began. It began by labor Zionists coming over in the early 20th century and forming these kibbutzes all along the coastal plain and buying areas of land and cultivating it. Is everyone with me so far? So they were very much linked to the land. They saw the conquest of labor and the conquest of land as one and the same thing. And for a lot of Jews, it was very redemptive. It was like a reversal of the diaspora. Even if they weren't religious, they still knew as part of their people's history that they'd been exiled from that land by various occupying powers. And this, returning back to the land of their ancestors and peacefully reclaiming it through buying land and cultivating it, they saw that as redemptive, as kind of a reversal of the diaspora. This is why, as well, most Israelis, even today, still live on the coastal plain. Even though in the Bible, the Israelites did not live on that plain at all. They lived in the hill country, this area, which in the Bible is Judea and Samaria. This area was occupied by what the Bible calls the sea people. peoples. So the Philistines, they lived on the coast, and other peoples as well. So really living where the Philistines lived. But
So do they cultivate that hill country?
no, it's not farmable at all. It's just rock. It's quite barren. There are trees on it, but they're kind of a recent import. I remember when first time I went to Israel, and we were in the hill country a bit, and it's quite beautiful now. There's lots of conifers and forests and stuff. But our guide, this Jewish man, he insisted they were kind of recent additions. And someone in our group went, "Oh no, the Bible talks about trees being here all the time. He mentions, the cedars of Lebanon," and the tour guide went, "Cedars of where?" so that's where the trees came from. As the hill country. No, it's very very barren indeed.
So how did, sorry to go back to the ancient Israelites, how did they survive?
Well, I mean, I think that they farmed animals, didn't they, and things like that, and you can farm in the hill country, just not very successfully. But no, they managed to survive. But it's a good question.
With trade as well.
Trade, there would have been an enormous amount of trade, I think. But yeah, that would have been certainly a part of it. Yeah. A lot of their economy revolved around livestock. The Bible's always talking about so and so's ox and sheep and goat and flipping, I don't know what's the other one, camel. I know camels are unclean actually. Yes, so that's why today the West Bank, we'll go into that much later, is kind of this bit here, because that's the hill country. It corresponds to that. And it was quite easy for the Jewish people to establish an agricultural economy on the coastal plain, because in recent years, the Ottoman Empire had become less insular. It started to make greater attempts to build an infrastructure in its outer provinces and to integrate into the world market. So the new Jewish settlers really kind of took advantage of these new policies of exporting sort of cereal and raw materials and other things as well. And there were also newly built sort of rail networks and stuff. So it was a good time for them to start arriving. But then something happened in 1914 that really gave the Jewish people living there a whole new opportunity. And that was, of course, the First World War. So the First World War has been described by many as the most transformative event in the history of the modern Middle East. The whole map of the Middle East was completely redrawn in 1917/1918. So we always imagine World War I as being a very kind of European war. Actually, it was everywhere. It was a world war. Not quite as widespread as the Second World War, but it still involved most of the world. So following the 1918 victory and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the Brits and the French immediately rushed in, as they always did, to seize control of as much of these territories in the Middle East as they possibly could. So there was a huge power vacuum all across the Middle East, the former areas that the Ottoman Empire had controlled, and lots of new nations suddenly began to spring up. The Ottomans, kept what land they could, and created the Republic of the Kingdom of Turkey, and including, as Mariam will know, a huge chunk of Armenia. What a lot of people don't know is that the first genocide in modern times was not the Holocaust, it was the Armenian genocide. So 1 million Armenians were murdered by the Turks during the First World War on forced death marches and other ethnic cleansing. It's still not recognized officially by the British government or many other nations, and the only reason for that is because they don't want to get on Turkey's bad side. It's pathetic. The
Welsh recognise it.
Huh?
The Welsh recognise it.
The Welsh do. Oh, that's good. So yes, Armenia suffered very badly during the war, but many other nations were created: Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Palestine, and Transjordan. Now, originally Palestine was part of Transjordan, and then it became a separate state, but still under British control. So Britain's occupation of Palestine, just to let you know, it lasted for 3 decades. So it began in 1917, it ended in 1947. And throughout that period, as we will see, Britain continuously failed to create a state of Arab and Zionist Jewish cohabitation. But truth be told, the reason why we held on to this colony is because we were concerned about protecting the Suez Canal. and also our overland trade routes to India. There were also fears of Russian expansionism, so the Russian Empire had also collapsed, as well as the Ottoman Empire. The Russian royal family, the Romanovs, had been murdered by Lenin and the Bolsheviks, and now the Soviet Union ruled Russia, so Russia had really gone sort of from out the frying pan into the fire, and the Soviet Union were looking to kind of expand communism across the world. So there were fears of that even as early on as the 1920s. Britain, very stupidly, made lots of deals. Is everyone with me still? Yeah, lots of deals with various different organizations and peoples after World War I, deals that we couldn't possibly keep. The first deal we made was with a man called Sharif Hussein, who was the Hashemite ruler, I have to always look at this, Hashemite ruler of the Hijaz region of Arabia. They promised him the creation of an independent Arab kingdom, sort of where Jordan is now, going down towards lower Saudi Arabia. So they really wanted Sharif Hussein's help because he was the guardian of Mecca and Medina, and they hoped that Hussein would oversee these annual pilgrimages, keep the peace, and most importantly, end the jihadist trouble that the Turks were stirring up. So Ottoman Empire, Turkey, was very bitter about the war, and they did not like the idea of the French and the Brits coming in, taking all their former kind of regions. So they tried to stir up kind of anti-colonial Islamic sort of violence in that region unsuccessfully. And so Britain was looking to kind of stop that by making a deal with this Hashemite ruler. We also made promises to the French. So in the whole of the Middle Eastern region, the northern half was controlled by the French, so they controlled Lebanon and Syria, and then the southern half, which was Egypt and Iraq, was controlled by Britain. Palestine, as always, poor Palestine, it falls in between. It's a very kind of, throughout history, it's always been a sort of thoroughfare. It's always in between places, in between Mesopotamia, Egypt, in between one empire and that empire. Now it was in between the British controlled part and the French controlled part. And France wanted the whole northern half of Palestine. They didn't get it because Britain were like, no, we need it to protect the Suez Canal and our other interests and everything, so you're not having it. So Palestine ended up being solely British controlled territory. So, here we go. Yes, so here's a map explaining it all.
Is that when it was called Palestine?
Yes, it was actually called Palestine now. I think you were saying that. So now this area of land, which I've written for the first time ever, is called Palestine, or British Palestine, or the British Mandate, as some people call it. So this is Palestine now, and there's no kind of divisions. It's all just one colony, if you like, at this point. So yes, Palestine was very much acting as a buffer zone. The British were using it. There were loads of soldiers and military camps in here after World War I. It was basically a military zone. We were using it as a protection for our interests. That was the main reason why we wanted it. However, we started to realize that lots and lots of Jews after World War I were coming into Palestine. They were living in those communities, those kibbutzes, and many of them were even kind of building sort of new areas, like the city of Tel Aviv, for example, that hadn't been there before. The population was urban as well as rural, so more and more Jews were coming in, and Britain, at the same time as this was happening, they were lobbied in Parliament by lots of British Zionists. I feel like I've missed something I needed to tell you. No, I think I've said. Oh yeah, I did mention, didn't I, that Palestine and Transjordan War, this was all the same kind of colony, and then it became two separate ones. It is yeah. So just so you're aware of that. So the British Zionists, the British Jewish community that supported Zionism, they said that Zionist interests were one and the same thing as British interests. They said that if a strong and united Jewish state could be created within Palestine, that would aid enormously all the British strategic aims in the Middle East. And the British government absolutely loved this idea. We thought, yeah, Zionism, Jews going to Palestine and supporting us and everything, that sounds absolutely great. A gentleman in Parliament called Arthur James Balfour, he was the British Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs at the time. He wrote to Lord Walter Rothschild, probably heard of him, who was probably the most
Rothschild.
Rothschild, yeah.
Bankers.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So the very, very prominent Jewish family in this country. Lord Rothschild at that time was probably the most prominent member of Britain's Jewish community in the post-World War I period. Arthur James Balfour, the British Secretary of State, wrote to him, His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. And this was known as Balfour Declaration, which might be worth reading out. This is the whole letter. So this is a letter that Arthur James Balfour wrote to Lord Rothschild. Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Oh dear. Or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. Yours sincerely, Arthur James Balfour. So a deal was made. That was towards the end of the First World War. That was November 1917. So this was already being kind of thought out before the Ottoman Empire even collapsed, because they knew they were going to win by that point. Sadly, there was much racialization underpinning this legislation. They didn't care about the Arab population in Palestine at all. It's horrible to say, but Arabs were still seen by most Europeans at that time as a sort of lesser people, as sort of like sand dwellers living in tents. There's a very kind of dim view of them. So they didn't really care that much about upsetting the local Arab population. There was also a lot of biblical romanticism going on in Parliament at that time. Most people obviously in Parliament were Christians or nominal Anglicans, and they loved the idea of, turning Palestine back into sort of Old Testament times, bringing the Jews back and making all the same borders as in the Kingdom of Israel and everything. It really appealed to them. And that's something, interestingly, that persists even today, not in this country, but in America. So there are Christian Zionists, believe it or not, in the United States. So there are lots of horrible conspiracy theories where anti-Semitic people say things like, Israel and all its kind of endeavors are funded by these American Jews and everything. No, they're not. They're funded by American Christians. They're funded by American evangelical Christians who, using verses from Ezekiel 27, I think, where it says something like, when the third temple is built, God will come again, and they think the rapture will happen. So they want to try and hasten the coming of the rapture. So it sounds mad. They are doing this. So they're pouring loads of money in to support Zionism. But I mean, it's really just kind of stupid. It's not a Christian thing to do. A lot of Jewish people in Israel, they think the evangelical Christians are being ridiculous. But obviously they'll take the money anyway. But so it's all kind of, anyway, this was happening as early as the beginning of the 20th century in our country, in our parliament. But sadly, they made anti-Semitic remarks to support it. They kind of really overemphasized the amount of power the European Jewry had. They were like, there are Jews everywhere, there are Jews in your country, there are Jews in our country, and they're all Zionists, and they want to create their own Jewish state, so we have to give it to them. Actually, that wasn't true at all. Jews did not have a lot of power in Europe, and the vast majority of Jews at this time had no interest in Zionism whatsoever. They were perfectly content to stay and live in Europe. About 9 million Jews living in Europe at that time. Only a few 100,000 now, believe it or not. But at that time, there was nearly 10 million Jews living in Europe. And most of them had no interest in moving over to the coastal region of Palestine.
It's only as big as Wales.
Yes, and all this was simply basically to keep the French out of Palestine. That was the whole kind of the point of it all. So it's pretty ridiculous. America was quite angry with Britain during this time. President Wilson wanted the end of World War One to also be the end of European colonialism. He was sort of like, look, all these old imperial powers in Europe getting at each other, trying to control the world, that's what caused World War One in the first place. World War One has ended, 3 great empires have fallen, 4 empires have fallen, and you and the French are still at it. You're still trying to colonize what he was really cross because he wanted all these newly created Arab states to be sort of, small self-determining democracies. He wanted the post-World War One to be an opportunity to bring about sort of liberty and democracy in the world. But French and the British had just cut up the Middle East between them. So he was angry. Then the Arabs got angry as well, because they eventually, the Arabs living mostly in the hill country, but still on the coastal plain as well, alongside the Jews, they got wind of this idea back in London, in British Parliament, to create a Zionist state. And naturally, they were very, very unhappy and worried about that. They didn't like the idea of being displaced by all these foreigners, that kind of thing. So they were very upset, and that was really the beginning of the Palestinian national identity. So the Arabs living in this part of the world before that, they didn't call themselves Palestinians. They were just Arabs living under Ottoman occupation. And now there were Arabs living on, yes.
At that time, then, do you know roughly how many Arabs there were living there? In that time, the Jewish people just started to settle in without any problem.
800,000. Yeah, so quite a lot. Yeah. Mostly concentrated in this area. Yeah. So, yes, this was the beginning of the Palestinian national identity. So Arabs in this part of the world for the first time are like, we are Palestinians. This is our land. Our ancestors have lived here. We don't want this taken away from us. And then in 1923, finally, after years of debating, Britain was granted a mandate by the newly created League of Nations, which after World War II would be called the UN, the United Nations. It was originally called the League of Nations after World War I. And they were given a mandate to govern Palestine, as the French were given a mandate to govern Libya and Syria and Lebanon. But there was a kind of condition. And the condition was you're only allowed to govern Palestine with the view of helping it to become a self-determining nation. And as and when they are capable of being an independent country, you are then to depart and leave them be. That was the deal. But I think the British probably like, yeah, okay, yeah, we're going to do this. Their hands on this colony, not going to go that easily. It's worth noting this was when the British Empire was at the height of its power. So 1922, 1923 is usually seen as kind of the peak of the British Empire. This is when like a quarter of the world's people were under the control of the king, who was also emperor of the biggest empire in history. So they didn't really take this newly formed League of Nations seriously. Yes, so we saw this, I guess, as an opportunity to be all condescending and patronizing. Oh, we can go in there and enlighten all the Arabs living there and everything, and make them sort of more like us and everything. And the Balfour Declaration was set in stone in this mandate. So despite Jews only making up about 10% of the population of Palestine at this time, they were going to be given a special privilege. So the British were now compelled, because the Balfour Declaration was in the mandate, they were now compelled to create a Jewish state. They were to encourage Jewish immigration and settlement, despite the growing tensions between Arabs and Jews at that time. Palestine, again, this was against the mandate. It was basically treated as a crown colony, which we were not allowed, we were not supposed to have done. So the idea was it was supposed to be run by the Foreign Office, and we were supposed to put in a sort of like a provisional kind of representative body made up of Jews and Arabs, but we never did that. It's really shady, but the transference of governance was given from the Foreign Office to the Colonial Office. So that was actually, according to international law, that was actually illegal. We did that. It was run by a high commissioner in Jerusalem from London, and he just surrounded himself by British officials, most of them military people from the First World War. There was no Arab or Jewish representative body whatsoever. They were completely controlled by the British. And it's actually unique in all the British colonies, because in every place that Britain colonized, it always put a sort of governor general as a kind of representative of the crown, and then tried to also put in a sort of representative government for the colony. It didn't do that for Palestine. It was just controlled directly. So that made the sort of transference of power from Britain to the occupied peoples really difficult when it came to gaining independence. So you can really see how a lot of the troubles that Israel-Palestine has today are because of what Britain did, the way we kind of cut it up, the way we controlled it, all the huge mistakes we made. It all goes back to this. So the Jews wanted a Zionist Jewish state. The Arabs wanted to make sure the British put a cap on the number of Jews immigrating and settling there, but the British would grant neither, and they were quite content to let all the kind of ethnic and religious squabbling and conflicts continue, because it was to their advantage, divide and conquer kind of thing. So yes, it's only British colony, never to have a local legislative council. And other nations were looking towards gaining independence. So Iraq gained independence in 1932, Egypt in 1936, but Palestine wouldn't gain independence till much, much later. Is everyone with me so far? Does anyone have any questions? Please do ask questions. Can I have some more water, please? However, despite the lack of the British occupying powers creating a legislative body, the Jewish community living in Palestine, which now made up about over 100,000, they were very well organized and united as a people. So the Arabs had no representational body whatsoever. So the Arab peoples living in Palestine, so they're starting to call themselves Palestinians, they were basically sort of kind of governed by these old sort of Arab nobility families living there for a very long time. But this wasn't very effective. These sort of Arab families tried to they wanted to hold on to their power, but in order to hold on to their power, they had to act as kind of go-betweens between the Arab peoples and Britain. So they had to work with the British government in order to maintain their noble kind of control. But also, they realized that was detrimental to themselves because they knew the Brits were wanting to create a Jewish state. So there was kind of like a double-edged sword to that, really. But the Jews living there at this time created the Yishuv. Everyone heard of that word, Yishuv? So this was their own representative body for the Jewish community in British Palestine. And they tried to, so basically all the kind of the huge areas of land, so hundreds of thousands of acres by this point, the communities were starting to draw together into a more sort of like coalesced whole, and they wanted to try and establish a proper Jewish nation themselves. It was kind of like, it was almost like a nation within a nation was growing. The Jewish Yishuv were not really that interested in Britain and were waiting for them to help them. They started to do it themselves. So they created a European-style society and economy in a very short space of time. And it is extraordinary, actually, when you think about it. Israel as a nation-state was only established in 1947, and in a very short space of time, it became a first-world country with some of the best healthcare, social provision, tertiary education, all that kind of thing on the planet. So they really did. I know a lot of people. There are obviously things that are terrible going on in Israel, but in terms of the society they managed to create for the Jewish people, it was pretty astonishingly amazing. But the Zionist leaders were quite embarrassed because out of the 700,000 living in Palestine, only around 10% were Jews. Immigration was painfully slow all through the 1920s. Jews weren't really that interested in Europe in moving towards Palestine. But then obviously in the 1930s, things in Europe began to change radically. Between 1933 and 1936, the number of Jews in Palestine more than doubled just in that 3-year period. By 1936, they constituted 30% of the population of Palestine. Most of these Jews that arrived in those 3 years had fled from Germany and Poland. It's worth noting that Poland was an extremely anti-Semitic country at that time, even though they were fighting against the Germans during World War II. It is worth remembering that Poland was kind of widely seen as the most anti-Semitic country really back then. There was so much growing anti-Semitism and sort of blood and soil nationalism at that time in the 30s. It's a really horrible time. And unlike before, whereas lots of Jews who moved over were kind of farmers and sort of from the kind of the more working classes, now you had lots of intellectual and professional Jews moving over, doctors, lawyers, teachers, things like that, musicians. So it was becoming more of a kind of a diverse society. So over 300,000 acres of land had now been bought off the Arabs. And this was obviously demoralizing for Palestinians. Arab peasant farmers had no choice. Their landowners had no choice. They're given enough that they could refuse. They sold these very expensive, very money these pieces of land. And then all the kind of Arab peasants and farmers were forced out of these areas of land into kind of the hill country region. So there was a lot of kind of economic displacement going on in this war.
It's interesting that they'd sort of like, I don't know, it's just their own people and their own. I don't know, it's just interesting to me that they're like, we've moved over here to escape being persecuted, but also you shove off over there now.
Yeah.
It's just interesting to me. That, yeah.
And all this newly bought land was only ever leased to Jews. Once it had been bought by Jewish immigrants, it was only ever kind of leased to other Jewish immigrants. So yeah, although still governed by the British, the Yishuv was effectively running the Jewish community now in Palestine. They created their own taxation system, healthcare and education systems, and they revived Hebrew as their national language. So before that, they all spoke Yiddish mostly, and now they said, actually, no, we're living in Israel now, we want to split out of Israel as it was, we want to speak Hebrew. So modern Hebrew is a bit different from ancient Hebrew. And they had to invent new words, Wi-Fi and stuff like that.
And they've got a sort of academy like French, sort of brings up Hebrew up to date.
I don't know. That's a good question. So the Yishuv at this time, the 1920s, created two very important institutions. The first was I'm trying to pronounce it properly, the Histadrut. The Histadrut was the Federation of Jewish Labor in Palestine. So they began the employment of Jewish labor in Jewish enterprises. So they were really promoting a very Jewish society, a Jewish economy, without any kind of dependence on their Arab neighbors, and it effectively became a sort of boycott, targeting Arab workers and pushing them away so Jews could come in and take their place. The other organization that was created was called the Haganah, which was the first Jewish military defense force. So this is kind of the early sort of ancestor, if you like, of the current IDF today. It began with the Haganah, and it was actually illegal for them to set this up. They were being occupied by British soldiers, and yet they were setting up their own military defense. But the Brits just didn't do anything about it. I think it was all a very badly managed colony. They didn't really care enough, and they just sort of let them do what they want. So you can see how the beginnings of an Israeli nation state were starting to take shape, even under Jewish occupation. Is everyone still with me? Is this boring? No. Okay, sorry. I feel like I'm being really boring. So also in the Jewish part of Palestine, so again, still mostly that region, they began setting up their own political parties as well. So the largest political party at that time was called Mapai, which was set up by Ben Gurion. That was the Labour Party, if you like. That was the Labour Zionist Party. It was the biggest party by far. And that was still promoting this idea of an agrarian economy, Jews coming over, settling, creating kibbutzes, and cultivating the land and gaining wealth from that. However, there was another gentleman at that time who was very popular called Chris Weissman, who he wanted, so it was a bit more kind of like what Herzl had been a couple of decades before. So he wanted to work with the British to create a Jewish nation state diplomatically, not just through some sort of gradual conquest by land and farming sort of thing. But again, it's proved unpopular. No one really wanted to work with the British to do that. Interestingly, the most anti-Zionist party was made up of ultra-Orthodox Jews. They were, and even today, Hasidic Jews, ultra-Orthodox Jews, are very often anti-Zionist. They see it as a heresy because they believe that one day Israel will be restored to the Jewish people, but they believe it will be done miraculously when the Messianic age comes about. So God will grant it back to them. So they see any kind of like forceful conquest of Israel as against what God's law plans in the future. So often you'll find that ultra-Orthodox Jews are anti-Zionist, and it was still the same back then. There were also the binationalists who actually wanted to create a state that was both Arab and Jewish. So, there were lots of Jews at that time who were very sympathetic towards Arabs and didn't want to just kick them out. They wanted to work with them. They wanted to create a sort of, not a two-state, a one-state, but a one state that included both Jews and Arabs ruling it. The most sort of aggressive Jewish politician at that time was a guy called Vladimir Jabotinsky. His party was the Revisionist Party. It was very right-wing. It was against Ben-Gurion's socialism. Also advocated the immediate withdrawal of all British forces and the automatic creation of a Jewish Commonwealth, not just in Palestine, but in Transjordan as well. So they wanted kind of the Jews to have all this area and also parts across the Jordan, because in the Bible, certain Jewish tribes, the half tribe of East Manasseh, it lives sort of on the other side of the Jordan in Gideon. Is it called Gideon? And you should know. Gilead. That's it. Yeah, Gilead is that's the character. So Gilead is where you see where these hills are on the east side of the Jordan. That's Gilead. So in the Bible times, one of the tribes, half tribe of East Manasseh, they lived in Gilead. Before the Israelite nation crossed the Jordan, the tribe of East Manasseh were kind of like, would be quite like this Gilead region. We want to stay here.
Something I don't quite understand. You're talking about the binational.
Yeah.
I mean, could Arabs work within the Jewish system? Could they be sort of MPs or whatever they have and rise up and become part of the system? Or was that just too silly?
Back then, they had no interest. Well, they didn't have an official parliament. It was just the Yishuv at that time.
There's no way an Arab could be part of the system.
You mean today or back then?
Well, back then.
Back then, no, because they wanted it to be a purely Jewish society and economy. Today, Arabs can actually become part of the Israeli parliament, but it doesn't happen very often. So they were becoming really unified as a people, but the Arab community, however, living there, and they were much bigger, they never managed this degree of unity. Were still governed by those old noble families who were still willing to compromise with the British authorities in order to keep their power. The British decided to appoint an Arab man called Haj Amin al-Husseini as the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, and he was later elected the head of the newly created Supreme Muslim Council, which was an attempt by the Arabs living there to create their own sort of equivalent of the Yishuv. But this was a doomed attempt, and it ended up exacerbating a lot of problems that were already going on there. So Hajj, he used Islam to promote his leadership of this newly created Palestinian nationalism, and it eventually led to the first outbreak of violence between Jews and Arabs in British Palestine, which was in 1929, the Western Wall riots. That was the first kind of moment of real violence between Jewish and Arab peoples living in Palestine. So, as most of you know, the Western Wall, or the Wailing Wall, is the only visible section of what remains of the Second Temple. So it was built by King Herod. It was this massive retaining wall designed to enlarge the platform on which the extensions of the Second Temple will be built. So the temple was destroyed by the Romans in AD 70. And that wall is all that kind of remains of it. It's therefore a significant place of prayer and pilgrimage for the Jewish people.
Is there much of it left?
The wall, yeah, the whole wall's there. But that's all that remains of it. Yeah. What?
Answers one of the 4 gates to the city.
Yeah, they're there, yeah. What a lot of people don't know, though, is that it's actually quite significant for Muslims too, because it's apparently where Muhammad tethered his horse while he was visiting Jerusalem, and of course is on the same site as the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So at that time, the Wailing Wall was part of the Arab section of Jerusalem. So Jews couldn't really access the wall very easily to go and pilgrimage there and to pray. In 1929, a group of Jews tried to claim the wall by putting up screens there and putting benches there and sitting there and sort of not moving. And then Hajj's Palestinian nationalists were very angry about this. They reacted strongly and told them to go away. And then the revisionist party, the extreme party in Israel, their youth movement came along and did like a mass demonstration as a reaction to the Hajj's nationalist protests. And then everything completely spiraled out of control. And soon there were large-scale riots in Jerusalem, also in Hebron, in Jaffa, in Safad. And a large number of Jews were massacred in Hebron. It was really awful. In total, over the course of the days of the riots, 133 Jews died and 116 Arabs died. So that was really the first bloodshed in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, 1929. That really marks the beginning of where everything started to go horribly wrong. It galvanized all the kind of communal hostilities that were already sort of simmering under the surface, and it really kind of ended any chance of an Arab-Jewish kind of peace process. The British occupiers were completely thrown. They didn't know what to do. They got really badly told off by Parliament for letting things get out of control like that. And a commission was set up. It was called the Shaw Commission, which criticised both Hajj Amin and his nationalism, and also criticised the continued growth of Jewish immigration and land purchases. They made it very clear in London, if you keep dispossessing Arab farmers and peasants by taking their land away from them, it's just going to make things a lot worse. And so they proposed a sort of cap on Jewish immigration and how much land they were allowed to buy, but that was unsuccessful. And then in 1930, the British issued something called the Passfield White Paper, which stressed the need to focus more on Arab concerns as well as Jewish concerns. So the British, government were really trying to sort of figure out what to do to resolve the tensions between Jews and Arabs, which they'd ignored so far, but now we're realizing they couldn't ignore anymore. But the white paper document was unpopular on both sides. Zionists were infuriated by this. British Zionists wrote to the then Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald, and they persuaded him to revoke elements of the white paper. So they no longer put a cap on how many Jews could emigrate there. Emigrate there. They no longer stop them from purchasing more land. And then the Palestinian Arabs by this point were just absolutely sick and tired of the British government. They were like, we've been occupied by the Ottoman Empire for centuries, and now we're being occupied by the British Empire. This has to stop. We want our own kind of, self-determination, independence. We want to be our own people in our own land. And obviously they felt very threatened by, Jewish immigration and all that. But they were nowhere near self-determination. The Arab noble family, as a replacement for the what was it called, the Islamic thing? The Supreme Muslim Council, that's it. Yeah, it was replaced by something called the Arab High Commission, which was a unity of all the noble families. Palestinian nationalism was now growing like really apace, and it was more interlaced with radicalization and religion than it had been before. So religion was now coming into the conflict as well as nationalism. So things were getting very, very ugly. And this continued all throughout the early 1930s. So then the riots were in 1929. Problems continued throughout the early 1930s, especially given what I said earlier, between 33 and 36. Lots more Jews started coming over in that wave because of persecution in Europe. And then in 1936, it all really kicked off. So in the spring and summer, 1936, it lasted for 6 months. This was after nearly 20 years of British dominance. Palestine quite spontaneously erupted into mass demonstrations, riots, protests all over the place. It was really awful. There was a general strike for 6 months, organized by the Arab High Commission. They attacked sort of railways and British sort of police stations. They attacked Jewish property, Yeshua buildings, things like that. It went on for months and months. But economically, actually, in the long run, worked against them because it accelerated the process of segregation. So the Yeshua, when the strikes were going on, the Yeshua says an opportunity to go, okay, look, well, you know, they're all on strike. It's causing economic difficulties for us. Actually, this is our time to prove that we are completely independent and self-determining, and that we don't need any kind of help from Arabs in our economy whatsoever. So that's when the Jewish kind of community became really economically self-sufficient during that kind of, so ironically, kind of worked against the sort of Arab community in a way. They also built a massive port in Tel Aviv, which is still in use today to help with their kind of exportations and everything. And further afield, the Palestinian nationalists were gaining more and more sympathy from their Arab neighbors. So the kings of Saudi Arabia and Iraq had a king then, were trying to bolster their legitimacy by getting involved in the affairs of, quote, our sons, the Arabs of Palestine. So they saw the Arabs living there as their sort of brothers and sisters, you know, because they're all Arabs, they're all Muslims, and they wanted to help them against what they saw as kind of a perceived sort of Jewish threat. The Abdullah of Jordan also had his own ambitions for Palestine too. He had his sort of designs on wanting to kind of conquer parts of it and things like that.
Daniel,
Yes.
you talked about all the Palestinians were Muslim. There's
No.
lots of Palestinians who were Christians.
Yeah, there were lots of
They-
Palestinian Christians as well.
Where are they at this point in terms of...
Oh, they're there. Yeah, and I think that they would doubtless have sided with the Palestinian Muslims, definitely. Yeah, so they would have been part of it. Sorry, I shouldn't just say Muslims. Obviously, they're Arabs, but there are Arab Christians and Arab Muslims. Arab Christians are definitely a minority at that time, but still a kind of a significant minority, much bigger than today. I'm going to say, sorry.
So they would sort of identify themselves on national lines rather than religious.
I think so. Yeah. They would have done. Yeah.
like Edward Said, very definitely a Palestinian nationalist.
Yeah, exactly. Like
but also a Palestinian Christian.
Yeah. There are lots of like most Palestinian Christians I know. They are definitely pro-Palestine. Like they're not pro-Israel. No. But even their life is still difficult for them because they're definitely like a sort of not very badly. Like it's basically just going to modern times. Sorry, my head is killing me. I'm just going to pause for a minute. Is that all right? Just take some painkiller. In the West Bank, Palestinians don't have it too bad. There's a lot more tolerance. Palestinian Christians don't have it too bad. There's more tolerance towards Christians there. In Gaza, however, Christians, it's hell on earth. Hamas basically tried to kill Christians. It's horrible.
Well, we had the chap, didn't we, that came to talk to us. Friends of the Holy Land.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yes, he did. Did he mention Gaza? Did he?
He said there were groups that were in Gaza. I don't think he particularly said that Hamas persecuted things.
Okay, yeah, no, they do. So yeah, these riots continue for 6 months throughout 1936. Where am I? I've messed up my pages, sorry. It's really annoying me, because I know there's a bit I need to talk about. Anyway, it ended horrifically. The British brought in 20,000 soldiers to stop all the riots, and they reckon around about 10% of Palestinian men were either killed, wounded, or exiled during that period where the British came in and stopped the riots. So this just made things a lot worse in the long run. It also meant the introduction of the Peel Commission. So the Peel Commission, they deduced that the terms of the mandate, the British mandate after World War I, which were about creating a Jewish state, they realized that this could not be fulfilled without creating conflict. They saw Jews and Arabs as being completely irreconcilable. They knew they had an impossible situation. And so they argued in the Peel Commission in London that if an independent state were to be created, it would have to be under Jewish or Arab control, which obviously would contain a significant minority of either. This report was published in 1939. So if you look on the maps that I produced, they had a plan in place to create a partition. So this is where the partition started. This was in the late 1930s, 1937. So all the green area on this map, that was going to be given over to Jews. That was going to be a Jewish state. The beige area, a much larger area, was going to be the Arab state. And then because we're British and we can't possibly give something completely away, we had to hold on to Jerusalem and Bethlehem, with a little corridor from there to the Mediterranean Sea. So that was going to be our little bit. It was a pretty pathetic plan. It didn't come to anything in the end. What's interesting is that you can see the partition was influenced by the modern Zionist settlements rather than by any kind of biblical maps, because the whole area where Israelites actually lived is firmly within the Arab state part. And it's all the kind of coastal plains and Galilee that were going to be given over to the Jews. The problem is, however, that although only 1,200 Jews, if this actually happened, only 1,200 Jews would be living in the Arab states part of the map. But in the Jewish states part of the map, that would still include a very large Arab minority, nearly half the population. If that green part became a Jewish state in 1937, nearly half people living in there would still have been Arab. So the Peel Commission determined that they wanted the partition to be, quote, clean and final. Guess what they proposed? They wanted, exactly. They proposed a forced exodus of 200,000 Arabs out of that Jewish area. And then the Palestinian part of the region, the beige bit, would have been given over to the Transjordan. So that would have been so the Abdullah of Jordan was very happy about that, as you can imagine. Zionists were not generally very happy, but they supported the idea because they thought it was better than nothing. Although they were a bit worried about the green bit beneath the red bit. They were like, well, that's cut off from the other bit. Is that not going to just end up falling into kind of,
Is that still a place?
Rehovot, yeah, it might have a different name now, but yeah, it's still there, yeah. But the Arabs, as you can imagine, flatly refused to be forced out of the homes of their ancestors. Yeah, and that began when that was made clear. This was the plan. The eruption of one of the biggest anti-colonial revolts that the British Empire ever had to deal with. So in 1938, there were non-stop riots, strikes, and protests, mostly in the hill country part of Palestine. So it was really, really bad. It continued for ages, and again, the British soldiers came in and cause an absolute yes.
I might just be getting a bit ignorant,
No,
maybe
no.
I didn't understand something, but why would the British, it just gives the impression that the British were a lot more favourable to the Jewish people than the Arab people. Is there a particular reason for that, or was it just kind of how it fell?
I think at this point they were just trying to come up with what they thought was the most sort of the best solution. But they could have been. I mean, they certainly, as we discussed before, they saw Arabs as kind of a lesser people, and they did want to create a Jewish state. That was very much part of the Balfour Declaration, the original mandate they were given. They wanted to make sure that the Jews could have their own home in that part of the world. Maybe, yeah.
So they were a bit like guided by that rather than thinking about the whole picture.
Yeah, I think we could say that, yeah. I mean, sadly, you know, in this country and in Europe, you know, there's always been anti-Semitism, but there's always been a kind of anti-Arab sort of Islamophobic sentiment as well. And again, I know that not all Arabs are Muslims, but most of them are. So
Also anti-German and anti-French.
we are.
Perhaps
Yeah.
not to the same extent, though.
The phrase dirty Arab was around when I was a child. Someone called someone a dirty Arab. So it just shows you what the thinking was.
Yeah, and imagine that would have been worse in the 1930s.
Well,
yeah.
And I imagine also that quite a few people in the Jewish population were from parts of Europe and weren't, you know, they weren't. So, sorry, what I'm trying to say is the Arab population were distinctly different.
Yeah.
from the Jewish.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
population.
Well, Jews, they were
Mixed
European.
up, mixed,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah,
And
yeah,
I would
yeah.
have thought that was probably another reason for favour.
Yeah, that's a good point. So when the Brits repelled, so when these Arab attacks were going on, the Jewish Yishuv, they created special night squads to repel the guerrilla tactics of the Arab attacks. And again, the revolt was violently crushed by thousands of British soldiers. Thousands of Palestinian Arab homes were destroyed. Social structures collapsed that the Arabs had tried to create. Their economy was in ruins, and then all the Arab noble families were exiled. But the Brits were determined in 1939 to continue with their plan of creating a partitioned Palestine for Jews and Arabs. But then obviously something other very significant event happened in 1939 which put a stop to all this, which was World War II. So if World War I brought about the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, World War II hastened the demise and the collapse of the British Empire. It left our economy in ruins, and after 1945, very quickly, rapidly, all the colonies became independent. Well, not all, but most of them. And so it was during the war, the World War II, just as World War I provided lots of new opportunities for Jewish people in terms of Zionism and taking advantage of this area of land. World War II now provided a whole other new set of opportunities. The Jewish people in Europe were now being persecuted relentlessly by Germans and also other nations as well. The British, we put a pause on the plans, which was highly criticized by Jewish people living in Palestine. They were like, look, our people are suffering in Europe. You should be allowing them to come over here and live in safety. But at this point, we were just too distracted by everything going on the continent. So this very much kind of got pushed to one side. Many Jews did flee to Palestine during the war. Sadly, most of them didn't get out fast enough. There were 9 million Jews living in Europe in 1939. By 1945, there were only 3 million Jews living in Europe. 6 million Jews were killed, as you know. 11 million people overall were killed during the Holocaust. So the 5 million were other Poles, Romani, Gypsy people, POWs, and lots of other kind of what they would call ethnic undesirables too. A lot of annoying people say things like, I've literally heard someone say this before, oh, the Jews always going about the Holocaust killing them, but lots of other people were killed as well. But it's important to remember that the murder of the Jewish people was very much the focal point of the Holocaust. The Holocaust would not have happened if there wasn't that anti-Semitic hatred already in place. The Germans just kind of saw killing Romanis and Poles as a sort of, for want of a better phrase, like a bonus kind of thing. But it wouldn't have happened if not for the Jews and their hatred of Jews. Yes. And obviously, World War II went on for a long time, 6 years, and during this time, the Jews living in the Holy Land continued to consolidate their communities, expand their urban areas, their economies, and everything. What a lot of people don't know is that this Hajj Amin gentleman and lots of other Palestinian Arab groups, they sided with the Nazis. They wanted the Germans. I'm not saying they necessarily had a Nazi ideology, but they wanted the Germans to defeat the Brits so they could get rid of the Jews for them, so they could have all the land to themselves. So there was all that going on as well. So the British occupiers during World War II had to also deal with certain Arab groups that were supporting Nazi Germany as well. But that was only a minority of Arab Palestinians. Most Arab Palestinians didn't support the Nazi regime. And then after World War II, it wasn't until after the war, obviously, that the full horrors of the Holocaust became known. We didn't, during the war, we weren't really sure what was happening. It wasn't until the Allied troops closed in on Poland and Germany and saw the camps for themselves. And even when that was that news of that was disseminated across the world and all the photographs of the Holocaust were shown and stuff, a lot of people didn't believe it was true. They thought it was anti-German war propaganda. They couldn't possibly believe that would have been real, but it was. The Jews, so we call it the Holocaust, which is Greek, from the Greek holocaustos, which means sacrifice by fire. It's to do with the whole, the Jews being put in the ovens, and I can't remember what his name was, but some academic made a comparison between that and sacrificing animals in pagan times, holocaustos, so Holocaust. But Jews consider it an inappropriate word, so they call it the Shoah, which is Hebrew for catastrophe or cataclysm. Lots of persecuted groups at that time have different names for it. So the Romani people in their language called it the porajimos, which means the devouring. So it was a huge turning point in Jewish history. And after the war, as you can imagine, many Jews that survived, because of the trauma, they just had no desire anymore to live in Europe. So many of them emigrated to either America or to Israel, to Palestine as it was still then. There was enormous sympathy for the Jews all around the world, particularly America. America were the main sort of supporters of the creation of a state of Israel. At this time, President Truman, he was like, come on, Brits, the Jews have suffered this horrific calamity. You need to give them their own nation in which to go to safety. So when this happened, it's worth remembering, when this happened in 1947, when the state of Israel was created, when they were given independence, that whole land, international support for the creation of a Jewish nation state was overwhelmingly in favor of it. So you have everyone around the world today saying they hate this state of Israel and they believe it should be dissolved. But at that time, there was huge sympathy for it. Apparently people have forgotten that time. Anyway, so that's what happened in 1947. The British realized that they were completely weakened and broken by the war. They had no control over Palestine. There was no point in holding on to it. So in 1947, Jewish state of Israel was created. And that's where we'll leave it for today. Yeah. Does anyone have any questions?
I was to say, well, clearly there was a lot of sympathy for Jewish people after the war, and that state of Israel was created. But I mean, it's not that people are sympathetic to Jewish people now. It's the fact that Jewish people illegally take the land. They're not sort of staying what they originally had. They're illegally taking.
Yeah.
So that's not about not being sympathetic, that's about a fact that they're actually stealing land.
We haven't got to that yet.
I'm over here next week. So.
Yeah.
Get in early.
West Bank Gaza wasn't created at this point. I'm just saying, yeah. And I don't entirely agree. I think that a lot of people who hate Israel hate Jews. They just don't kind of realize it. So that's yeah. Anyway.
Something that I find, so my partner's family is Jewish and live in Israel, and something that I find really interesting that people don't seem to realise is how many Israelis don't support the government and are favourable of the Palestinians.
Yeah.
It's been really interesting.
Yeah.
My school has a huge Arab community, and there's a lot of pro-Palestine that's actually anti-Semitic sort of language that goes on. And obviously I can't say anything, but I'm sat there and I hear some things they say, and I'm like, you've never met an Israeli in your life. If you think that all Israelis believe that, you've never met an Israeli. Actually, a lot of people there don't agree with it, but in the same way in Nazi Germany, there were plenty of Germans that didn't support the idea, but you can't go around saying that because you would have been next. You would have been next, you know.
Political parties that the Israelis vote for are pretty obnoxious.
Oh, they are, yeah, it's outrageous. They only just got in this time.
I was going to say, he was nearly in prison, Netanyahu, and then he made some dodgy deal with the far right party and stayed in power. Like,
just about, yeah.
Yeah, he did,
Daniel, can you remind me when did partition happen in India? Because that was such a disaster, wasn't it?
That was 19.
Why did they come out
That
with
was
a
48.
similar plan?
Yeah, that was 48. So yeah.
Cyprus, we seem to be very good at that.
So
Ireland, yeah.
What interested me, you said that because we're told often on the news that right-wing Jews favour expansion in Israel, right-wing Israelis. But now you were saying that the ultra Orthodox Jews don't believe in Zionism. I didn't realise that.
Yeah, well, some of them do. A lot of them don't. Yeah. It's worth.
An ignorant question: are there Hasidic Jews in Israel who don't believe in Zionism?
There will be. Yeah. But I think a lot of them do. But the Hasidic Jews mostly live in Jerusalem.
Yeah, when I went, they live very much in their own little community, don't they? And they
So-
don't actually integrate with everybody
No,
else.
so those are state-sponsored. Yeah, they're state-sponsored communities. So because they believe in Jewish culture and everything, the government pays for them to basically just sit and do nothing all day. Yeah, just sort of pray. But so Jerusalem is the poorest part of the state of Israel. That's because it's a kind of self-made poverty. They deliberately live simplistic sort of lifestyles, whereas Tel Aviv and Haifa are very wealthy cities. They always say Jerusalem is a city of religion, Haifa is a city of work, Tel Aviv is a city of leisure. So that's kind of,
Sorry, I'm not coming out next week. There's one thing, so I'll put other things the week after, but it's quite interesting to try and distinguish between anti-Semitism and criticism of Israel, because it seems to me the two tend to get mixed up from time to time. You don't have to be anti-Semitic to criticise Israel.
No, I'm not saying, so criticizing Israel I think is fine, but it's when people say that Israel just shouldn't even exist kind of thing. I think that for me is problematic. Like I don't know. I mean, obviously feel free to disagree, but that makes me profoundly uncomfortable. But I don't know. But I know a lot of people would disagree and think
Daniel,
that yes.
it goes like that to the Book of Esther when that wicked Haman they wanted the Jews eliminated then.
Yeah.
So what was all that about?
Well, yeah, it's the oldest hatred
And
in the
they would
world.
have had them wiped out if it hadn't have been pointed down.
It is the oldest hatred in the world.
So that was a form of.
Yeah, ironically, Hitler in one of his speeches described himself as a second Haman, who's the guy that, and then he ended up dying the same way as Haman. So it's kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. What an idiot. Yeah, no.
Not just for that.
No, not just for that. No, lots of other reasons. Yeah, I'm just gonna stop recording now.